Everyone, and thank you for coming to our second lecture in the series this year of Acting Justly, Living the Mercy of Jesus. Our presenter this evening is probably no stranger to people in Brisbane. He's, although not originally local, but he is definitely local now, Dr Ray Campbell, who is currently the Director of the Queensland Bioethics Centre and of the John Paul II Centre for Family and Life, which are both agencies of the Archdiocese of Brisbane. Ray, by training, is a philosopher and theologian. He has his doctorate in moral philosophy. He has been a lecturer in moral philosophy, bioethics and moral theology at Catholic Theological Union, Hunters Hill. But presently, as Director of the Queensland Bioethics Centre, Ray has been involved in making submissions to government inquiries and debating matters of public policy on issues such as surrogacy, euthanasia, experimentation on human embryos, cloning, and other such related issues. So there's no better person local to be talking to us this evening about mercy and life issues. Let's please make Ray welcome.
Well, thanks, Paul, for that welcome, and thank you all. When Paul first rang me up and asked me about giving a talk as part of the series and said mercy and life issues, I sort of heard the life issues and said, oh yes, of course, no problem. And then I started to sit back and think and take in the first part of that title, mercy and life issues. And where was that going to lead me? What was that going to mean in the sense of what I might want to share with you this evening? And to some extent, as I sat with that and events unfolded around us, to some extent the events set the tone, at least for the first part of what I'm decided to talk about tonight. So I'm going to look at, if you like, three life issues. The first is capital punishment, then something on euthanasia and something on abortion, actually in reverse order, something on abortion, then on euthanasia. But I'm going to spend the first part of the time, and probably the greater part, talking about the first one, capital punishment. And as I said, one of the reasons for that was because of the recent happenings in round about our own area. We've all been aware of the recent, of course, executions in Indonesia, which has highlighted the issue of capital punishment, and even since then the condemning to death of the bomber in the United States. Now, capital punishment in that sense isn't something new. These just happen to be high-profile cases which have drawn our attention to it. But in particular, as I listened to the discussion, and you know, there was discussion galore leading up to the unfortunate executions in Indonesia, I was somewhat concerned regarding some of the things that I heard. And that's what made me move in the direction of spending the first part of tonight talking actually about capital punishment and where I see the church moving in particular regarding the issue of capital punishment. Some of the things I heard, one that in particular that disturbed me, was that time and time again people on talkback radio, etc., in talking about this issue, one of the things they'd say was, well, Indonesia has its laws and we've just simply got to respect the laws of Indonesia. And sometimes even those who were asking for mercy for the condemned young men would still start off with that kind of preface. And that sounds very fine, but in actual fact it's a fallacy at the very start. It's what we would call in legal philosophy a kind of positivistic understanding of the law, that if the law of the land is there and it's been enacted, then it must be right. It's amazing how quickly we can forget that after the Second World War we talked about such things as crimes against humanity that no law justified someone in doing. In other words, that there is something that stands before and behind that gives foundation to the law of the land. So the fact that something is the law of the land is not in itself the be-all and end-all. There's still the question of, is it a just law? And it seemed to me that there was a lot of people missing that question regarding this issue. And of course, some would say, well, yes, it is a just law, and that's at least someone reflecting on the issue, but at least we need to ask that question. But the other thing which actually struck me was that in nearly all the discussion, for those advocating that the sentence to death not be carried out, that nearly all the discussion was in terms of mercy. Now, that's very understandable, but I'm going to suggest tonight that perhaps that's not sufficient or adequate, particularly if we want to carry on and discuss capital punishment into the future. So, when we come to capital punishment, the way I pose it here is, what should be our response? Is our response one of, we ask for mercy in light of someone being sentenced to death? And this is generally what was happening in the case of the young men in Indonesia. Or should we actually be asking for justice? And if we're asking for justice or respecting justice, does that mean we're saying, oh, well, the justice is that they should be put to death? Or does justice actually say there shouldn't be capital punishment? Or, to use another expression, should it be in terms of merciful justice? You could say, well, that's someone trying to take a bob each way. Yes and no. Anyhow, to move on, what I want to do tonight is I'm proposing a thesis. And the thesis is that the Church's opposition to capital punishment has moved from being based upon mercy to being based upon justice, God's merciful justice. Now, that's somewhat controversial, and it won't be necessarily universally agreed to, although I'm going to try and put forth evidence to support that thesis. But there's still a very strong opinion within the Church that would say capital punishment is just, but that in the name of mercy, we should not carry through with the exercise of capital punishment. I'm going beyond that to say that in most cases, particularly regarding how the Church is responding in the sense of the authoritative teaching of the Church, it's actually moving to claim that capital punishment is not just. So it might seem a bit strange to be going down that path when I'm doing a talk on mercy and life issues, but I think it's very important because we talk about mercy so much in the context of capital punishment, and as said, understandably why, but we also need to bear in mind the justice aspect of capital punishment, and perhaps we need to revisit that. So here's the basis for my thesis. And one of the reasons I'm focusing upon this, I should say, is that I think the thinking behind what I believe is the shift in the Church's position highlights something that goes to the heart of all the life issues. And I'll draw that out more towards the end of my presentation. So, I start off in 1989. What was called the Revised Project was sent out to bishops throughout the world. The Revised Project was the beginning of the drafting of the Universal Catechism for the Catholic Church, the new catechism. So a commission had been set up and they sent out, as it were, drafts, if you like. And this Revised Project had this to say about capital punishment. It would be fitting to set aside the death penalty exacted by society on those found guilty of crimes of extreme gravity. Although the punishment is legitimate, the Church hopes for a habitual recourse to clemency, which is moreover in the spirit of Scripture and particularly in the Gospel, If it is necessary to protect society and prevent crime, there is also the duty to be merciful, as the Heavenly Father is merciful. So there, if you like, is the mercy approach. There's the contradiction to my thesis, or there is the starting point. Notice there's the acceptance of the death penalty as legitimate. In other words, that society, that those entrusted with the care of society, with the governance of society, as part of their role to protect their citizens, must inflict punishment on wrongdoers. And even have the right to inflict capital punishment for serious crime. But having said that, the drafters said that the Church would hope for habitual recourse to clemency, that is, mercy. So yes, capital punishment is legitimate, but let us show mercy. And why? Well, this is more in keeping with our duty to be merciful as the Heavenly Father is merciful. So that's just 1989. Now, in 1992 came the first edition of the Catechism, what was known as the French edition. Now, as such, it's not the official edition of the Catechism. The official edition is when the Latin translation is published. And in a sense, they published the French and from which other editions were translated, knowing that there was probably going to be further refinement of the Catechism. But this is what the Catechism said in 1992. Preserving the common good of society requires rendering the aggressor unable to inflict harm. For this reason, the traditional teaching of the Church has acknowledged as well-founded the right and duty of legitimate public authority to punish malefactors by means of penalties commensurate with the gravity of the crime, not excluding, in cases of extreme gravity, the death penalty. For analogous reasons, those holding authority have the right to repel by armed force aggressors against community in their charge. So there's a statement, once again, regarding the legitimacy of capital punishment. Notice, though, that little sentence tacked on the end. For analogous reasons, those holding authority have the right to repel. Now, the justification for repelling the aggressor is defence. And this is important as we move on. For analogous reasons, it's said there. In other words, it's inferring that the capital punishment is somehow related to a defence of society, not some of the other reasons for capital punishment. Now, this section of the Catechism then continued. If bloodless means are sufficient to defend human lives against an aggressor and to protect public order and the safety of persons, public authority must limit itself to such means because they better correspond to the concrete conditions of the common good and are more in conformity to the dignity of the human person. And you notice what's missing. There is no mention, as I say in the next dot point, there is no mention of mercy or clemency. There is no appeal to mercy in the Catechism just 3 years after the 1989 project, revised project. Even by this time, there had been a change, a shift in thinking, because it doesn't just say, it says that if your means of punishment, if the aggressor can be restrained, the public authority must limit itself. That's a must. Not we hope, but it must limit itself to such means. Why? Not because they're merciful, but because they correspond to the concrete conditions of the common good and are more in conformity with the dignity of the human person. So that's the development just from the revised project to the actual French edition of the Catechism. What came next was Evangelium Vitae, the Gospel of Life encyclical of John Paul II. in 1995. And he addressed all the life issues, and if you've never read that encyclical, then I do recommend it to you. It's, unlike some encyclicals, it's not that difficult to read. It's a good analysis of many of the situations that we face in our world today, and gives a very clear background, if you like, and an explanation, and even more so than most encyclicals, of the actual teaching of the Church. But on capital punishment, this is what John Paul II said, and I have to abbreviate some of the paragraphs here, but he said, number 56, this is the context in which to place the problem of the death penalty. And he points out that in this matter there's a growing tendency both in the Church and in society to demand that it be applied in a very limited way, or even that it be abolished completely. Now, the context that he talks about, this is the context, was the context again of self-defence. The paragraphs preceding this were about that you could defend one's life even as if in the defence you caused the death of someone threatening your life, not by directly killing them, but that their death came about as a side effect of the defence of life. That was very clear on the way he explained that self-defence. So it goes on and says, this is the context in which he's now talking about capital punishment, defence. He then goes on to say, it is clear that for these purposes to be achieved, and the purposes are the purposes of punishment, which I'll come back to in a moment, the nature and extent of the punishment must be carefully evaluated and decided upon, and ought not to go to the extreme of executing the offender, except in cases of absolute necessity. And he expands on that. In other words, when it would not be possible otherwise to defend society. When it would not be possible otherwise to defend society. Today, however, as a result of steady improvements in the organisation of the penal system, such cases are very rare, if not practically non-existent. And he then goes on to quote that paragraph that I just had before from the Catechism, what was the Catechism at that time, the French, the 1992 version. And so John Paul II seems to have narrowed that scope of when capital punishment might be justified. Once again, you notice no reference to mercy, no reference to clemency. It's about when it might be justified. It might be justified only when it is the only way to actually defend society. In other words, to actually prevent the person here and now from doing further harm. That would justify the capital punishment. And he says even in our modern systems, such cases would seem to be practically non-existent, that we should have to revert to that. So it seems to me and to many that John Paul II was grounding his objection to capital punishment in justice. And as I said, he repeats that paragraph from the Catechism at that stage, which said, that this is because it's more in keeping with the common good and more in keeping with the respect for the dignity of the human person. So now we come to the 1997 Catechism, and this is the official Latin version is now released, and that's the Catechism as we know it today. And there were very few amendments made between the 92 Catechism and the 97 one, but the one significant amendment was in capital punishment. And so this is what it says. Assuming that the guilty party's identity and responsibility have been fully determined, the traditional teaching of the Church does not exclude recourse to the death penalty. So you still have this acknowledgement of the death penalty if this is the only possible way of effectively defending human lives against the unjust aggressor. In a sense, the Catechism has gone even more explicit than John Paul II. If this is the only way of effectively defending human lives against the unjust aggressor. If, however, non-lethal means are sufficient to defend and protect people's safety from the aggressor, authority will limit itself to such means these are more in keeping with the concrete conditions of the common good and more in conformity with the dignity of the human person. The repetition of that phrase again. And so we've had a clear move from the 1989 version, which talked about the appeal to clemency, to a treatment of capital punishment which doesn't appeal to mercy or clemency, but appeals to justice, the demands of the common good. That's justice. Respect for the dignity of, or being in conformity with the dignity of the human person. That's an appeal to justice. And so it would appear that one of the grounds at which we are, the church has moved towards its response to capital punishment is to say, yes, it's legitimate on the same terms as self-defence is legitimate, and only on those terms. If we go back to just excuse me for a moment. My remote doesn't allow me to go backwards. If we go back to just at the bottom of this side, when we talk about the purpose of punishment, the traditional understanding of what legitimises punishment is to redress the disorder caused by the offence. And in traditional defending capital punishment, some would say that the perpetrator, the wrongdoer, has exercised their freedom to gain an advantage and has taken a human life in doing that. How do you redress that disorder that's been created by him doing that? The answer was, well, one way is to remove his life. It's kind of like an eye for an eye, but it's a sense of redressing the imbalance of justice. And that's one of the purposes of punishment. The wrongdoer is punished to, in a sense, take away the advantage the wrongdoer has gained through the misuse of their freedom. One of the other reasons for punishment is to defend the public order and safety. So that's actually protecting the citizens. And then thirdly, rehabilitation. Well, the threat of capital punishment might serve, to some extent, a temporary rehabilitation or a very short rehabilitation, depending on how long you're given to live. But it's certainly not a long-term goal of capital punishment. To some extent, defending public order, the idea of capital punishment as a deterrent might come into that concept. That's one of the ways in which public order is defended. However, the church has never been particularly strong in its official teaching on the idea of capital punishment as a deterrent, because that invokes the idea that you kill in order to achieve some other purpose of deterring someone else, rather than simply redressing the imbalance of justice. But I won't go further into those. My main point here tonight is to say, note that when both the New Catechism and John Paul II talked about capital punishment, it only recognised the second of those as a reason for capital punishment, namely defence. It did not recognise redressing the disorder caused by the crime as justification. That's not stated in any way in any of those statements. And so it seems to, as I said, to be something that is limiting that justification of capital punishment. And that was the statement from John Paul II. Now, if we move to more recently, Pope Francis. Pope Francis's approach to capital punishment, and this is just recently to delegates of the International Association of Penal Law this last year. Francis made this statement: "It is impossible to imagine states today fail to employ means other than capital punishment to protect the lives of other people from the unjust aggressor." So Francis just says, it's impossible to imagine you do anything other than not have capital punishment, that you wouldn't use some other means. And notice once again that the rationale given to protect the lives of others. They don't know. Now, Pope Francis went on to say, St. John Paul II condemned the death penalty, as does the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Now, you can understand why people have a little bit of a problem at times with Pope Francis, because that's not what St. John Paul II said, nor does the Catechism. They both had that little gap where they didn't quite categorically defend capital punishment. So in a sense, it's a slight exaggeration. Certainly it was the sentiment, but it's not quite an accurate portrayal. But you understand where Pope Francis is going when he says something like that, because then he himself will say quite clearly, just this year, to the delegation of the International Commission Against the death penalty is unacceptable regardless of the seriousness of the crime. Categorical. Now, I'm not saying that these statements made by Pope Francis are at the same magisterial level as, for example, Evangelium Vitae, but still they've been repeated statements, and they're certainly in keeping with the sentiments of Evangelium Vitae, and I think they do show where the teaching of the Church is shifting. And I want to just say something about what I think lies behind that. And I've given underneath that sentence from Pope Francis, again, another quote from Evangelium Vitae, where St. John Paul II said, "Not even a murderer loses his personal dignity." Now, the actual fact, it's interesting, the context in which he says that. If you remember, in Evangelium Vitae, he begins with a reflection upon Cain and Abel. The story of Cain and Abel, how Cain killed Abel. And part of the point of the story is the way John Paul II recounts it is, of course, that God did not kill Cain. Indeed, he put a mark on Cain so that he'd be protected. God didn't exercise capital punishment. And it's in that context that John Paul II says, not even the murderer loses his human dignity. And this is one of the things which I think was constant in John Paul II's own writings and his own life, and that is reflected throughout the rest of Evangelium Vitae, this understanding of the great dignity of the human person and what that means regarding our respect for the human person. And then going back to Pope Francis, once again to the same delegation, he said, "The death penalty is an affront to the sanctity of life and to the dignity of the human person." Francis, one of the headings talks about the primacy of life and being what he calls pro homine, for the human being, for the human person. So Francis, in the same line as John Paul II, sees that the sanctity of life cannot be forfeited. It cannot, in a sense, be lost. It does nothing entitle someone else to directly take the life of another person. And he goes on, that last dot point, it contradicts God's plan for humankind and society and God's merciful justice. This is where I took that expression from. It contradicts God's merciful justice. He brings the two together because the justice of God is one which recognises always with a merciful love the dignity of the human person. And so I put my thesis to you that on those grounds, that a deepening of this understanding of the dignity of the human person and the fact that justice must always be informed by love, that our response to capital punishment is one of merciful justice. Just to unpack a little bit further that foundation I'm talking about, one of the things that St. John Paul II did was continually reflect upon the nature of the human person and the relationship with Christ. You might recall the very first encyclical of John Paul II was Redemptor Hominis, Jesus Christ, the Redeemer of man, and which he said that man was the way of Jesus and Jesus was the way of the man. Understanding that we can only understand ourselves to the extent that we grow in our understanding of Jesus Christ. And part of that was grounding his great appreciation for the dignity of the human person. And probably more than many others have done for quite some time, John Paul II explored the meaning of someone being created in the image and likeness of God, what we commonly refer to as the imago Dei, made in the image of God. We find that running throughout his writings. And I think it's that combination of understanding and deepening our understanding of what it means to be made in the image of God, to be the Imago Dei, to be united with Christ, as Christ has said, that has led to this deepening of an understanding of what it means to respect the dignity of the human person, even to the extent that we have moved away from a justification of capital punishment. And so, even though this is called the mercy and life issues, on the first one, where we might traditionally have thought this would be the one we would talk about mercy most, I want to put to you that we need to talk about justice as well as mercy, because in so doing we can help to deepen that understanding of the dignity of the human person, which cries out to be respected even in the one who has committed the most heinous of crimes. So now I'm going to move on and talk a little bit about abortion. And under abortion, I want to talk about mercy and compassion. You'll notice that I haven't actually defined what mercy is, and I missed the first lecture, so I don't know how it was approached at that lecture. It is a problematic term for us because we have various words which we use, and various words which are sometimes used to translate different terms. And mercy and compassion are very close to each other. And sometimes the word mercy is used when we're really meaning something closer to compassion. Or we're using mercy in the sense which is the same as compassion. I noticed in the translator's introduction to Cardinal Casper's book on mercy, he talks about some of the words that Cardinal Casper uses, and the first two, and I won't try and say them in German, but he talks about two words which Casper uses, and he's translated both those words by the word mercy. So what was two words in Casper's original text has become one word in English. Now, whether that he says that in the text, he does often bracket what was the word used, so you might be able to pick up the nuances, but it shows you some of the difficulty in this language. Similarly, if we're translating from Latin to English, we see the word misericordia, we generally go and translate that as mercy. But actually, in many cases, misericordia is actually closest to compassion, because that's the literal meaning of misericordia, having the heart for the poor. That's what the literal translation of the Latin is. So we do have a little bit of a language problem. One of the, if you look up our dictionaries, the English dictionaries, and I checked on 4 of them in preparing for this, the very first meaning given for mercy always relates to the sense of forgiveness for a wrongdoer by someone who is in a position of power over the offender. That's our traditional understanding of mercy, someone who has the power to extend merciful forgiveness to a wrongdoer. But then we use mercy in a whole lot of other contexts as well. So it's bearing that in mind that I talk about mercy and compassion in context of abortion. I'm just going to give 2 quotes in a sense to try and pick out a little bit of the difference of when we're talking about compassion and when we're talking about mercy. So this is, once again, we're going back to Evangelium Vitae and Pope John Paul II talking about abortion. And one of the passages, he says this: "It is true the decision to have an abortion is often tragic and painful for the mother. Insofar as the decision to rid herself of the fruit of the conception is not made for purely selfish reasons or our convenience, but out of a desire to protect certain important values, such as her own health, or a decent standard of living for the other members of the family. Sometimes the fear of the child to be born would live in such conditions that it would be better off if the birth did not take place." And then he goes, "Nevertheless." What's going on there? As much as you can in a kind of encyclical document, John Paul II is getting to the question of what are the motives that stands behind this decision for the woman. Trying to understand the decision, and that's compassion. Understanding the suffering that the other person's going through. You might not agree with where they end up as a result of that suffering. That's the nevertheless he goes on to say there in the rest of the document. But it's an attempt to understand it. And that's what we mean partially by compassion. being in touch with the motives of the other person, trying to understand what's led to that. And that is very important in our approach to the question of abortion, which I'll highlight more in a moment. The next quote is then later, towards the end of the encyclical, he talks to the women who have been through an abortion. And he said, "I would now like to say a special word to women who have had an abortion. The Church is aware of those many factors which may have influenced your decision." There's the compassion again. "And she does not doubt that in many cases it was painful and even a shattering decision. The wound in your heart may not yet have healed. Certainly what happened was and remains terribly wrong. There's still the acknowledgement of the truth. But do not give in to discouragement and do not lose hope. Here's mercy coming in. Try rather to understand what happened and face it honestly. If you have not already done so, give yourselves over with humility and trust to repentance. The Father of mercies is ready to give you his forgiveness and his peace and sacrament reconciliation. You will come to understand that nothing is definitively lost, and you'll also be able to ask forgiveness from your child who is now living in the Lord." So in that passage, once again, as much as you can on a paper encyclical, it appears to me that John Paul II is giving us a witness to both compassion and mercy. The understanding of what might have led to this abortion, and that readiness to forgive, that encouragement to seek healing, to seek to heal the wound in the heart. And that's what mercy is, that willingness to extend that healing and forgiveness to others. That treatment of abortion and much of the discussion which went on both before and after Evangelium Vitae did lead to a development of what we might call a different approach to the question of abortion within the Church. And I don't want to overemphasise this, but it is a shift, once again, which I think is important. It was what we call a woman-centred approach. Just to give you a contrast, previous to this, generally speaking, the approach to abortion was to focus upon the death of the child, the tragic loss of life. And of course, this is what is intrinsically wrong with abortion, is that an innocent child loses its life, deprived of their life. And that tended to be the main focus, and often the only focus, in talking about abortion. John Paul II, through his, what he has said in Evangelium Vitae, was asking people to take a bit of a wider approach. He wasn't saying forget about what makes abortion intrinsically wrong. Indeed, he reaffirms that very, very clearly. But what he said was, we need to look at why women are driven to abortion. What stands behind it? And that's when you start to reach out in compassion towards a woman who might be tempted towards having an abortion, growing to understand what stands behind it. And so when we talk about a woman-centred approach, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about one that focuses upon the motives and how we respond to that. The first dot point there is from that book of Casper, where he talks about, we're not talking about a pseudo-mercy. A pseudo-mercy would be the kind of compassion, the misleading compassion that would say, well, I'll take you down to the abortion clinic. That's not genuine compassion. That's not genuine mercy, as Casper says. That's a pseudo-mercy. No, it's one which still affirms the truth, but does focus upon the motives and therefore seeks to say, how can we help? What can we do to make sure that that's not something you feel you have to do? And also focuses upon the idea of healing for those who have had abortion. Not just a matter of going to reconciliation. That was one of the things John Paul II talked about. But anyone who knows people who have been through the trauma of abortion knows that you often need much more than that. You need a community of support. You need an opportunity to talk. You need the opportunity to heal. You need the opportunity, as they often say, to be able to name your child. And so we have processes. One of the Catholic movements that exists is called Rachel's Vineyard, which is a weekend retreat for people who have been affected by abortion, not just mothers, but it can be grandparents, it could be the father. Anyone who's actually been affected by an abortion can benefit from going through a period of reflection and being able to face that and help along in the healing process. And so this was, once again, a bit of a shift, a pastoral shift, if you like, regarding our approach to abortion. And we ran here throughout Australia under the auspices of the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference. We ran a series of workshops called Walking with Love, which was about alternatives to abortion. So recognising what leads to abortion and responding to it. And that's a work of mercy. And also recognising those who have been through a termination and being willing to reach out and help them in their healing. And there are various ways in which that has been explored as a result of those seminars throughout the countryside. I like this expression from John Paul II regarding the person who receives mercy. The person who is the object of mercy does not feel humiliated, but rather found again and restored to value. And that's very much the case when we're dealing with someone who's going through post-abortion, helping to restore them to value. That's mercy. That's reaching out. I find it very interesting to remind people about Dives in Misericordiae. It was Pope John Paul's second encyclical. Most people seem to be surprised to learn that John Paul II actually wrote an encyclical on abortion over 20 years ago, 1980. And yet that was his second encyclical, rich in mercy. And in a sense, Pope Francis is picking up many of the themes that were in that encyclical, and he's calling for a year of mercy, a Jubilee year of mercy. I just want to say something briefly in this context of abortion, because it's something I get frequently asked, and I was strangely enough, I was at a conference in Adelaide just the other day, which was actually on euthanasia, but someone asked me the question about abortion and excommunication. And so I thought it might be worthwhile just to close off, particularly given the year of mercy that Pope Francis has declared. We often hear people talk about sin, and people saying, if you've been through an abortion, well, the church says you're excommunicated. Well, there are two provisos on that. One is that the usual conditions for mortal sin is one has to be fully free and have full knowledge of what's involved. Many of the women who undergo termination do not do so with full knowledge or full freedom. I wouldn't necessarily say the same about some of those who are performing the abortion. To my mind, that in 9 cases out of 10, they bear the greater guilt. So there's that question, first of all, is before you're excommunicated, you actually have to have truly committed the mortal sin with full knowledge and full freedom. The canon law itself explains that one of the reasons why the Church imposes so-called excommunication is to highlight the seriousness of this particular wrong. It's interesting when Pope Francis announced as part of the Year of Mercy, the Missionaries of Mercy, he said that they will have the faculty to forgive sins reserved to even the Holy See. And he didn't mention any sin, any particular sin at all. Nor did the Archbishop at the press conference explaining more about the Missionaries of Mercy. But one journalist, after the conference, asked, does that include abortion? And Monsignor or Archbishop said yes. And if you pick up the media, do a Google search about the Missionaries of Mercy, you'll find abortion mentioned. As if that was at the centre of the sending out the Missionaries of Mercy, that they would have faculties to forgive abortion. The fact is, here in Australia, every priest who has the faculty in the diocese has the faculty to lift the excommunication from abortion, and have had for years. It's not a sin reserved to the bishop in Australia and in many other places throughout the world. It's not uncommon for dioceses, for the local clergy just to be given as part of their faculties, the faculty to lift that excommunication. And that is the case here in Australia. So it's actually a non-issue from that point of view within the Australian Church. But it was just interesting how the media picked up on that. Now, the Missionaries of Mercy will have many other many other serious things, I think, on their mind. But that was just an interesting sort of postscript that emerged as a result of this Year of Mercy. Now, just to the last few minutes, I just want to say something briefly about euthanasia, because the thing about euthanasia is often referred to as mercy killing. And so here we have the word mercy. Now, it's interesting the connotations that might have. Particularly to think of the first meaning of mercy that I referred to, that refers to a sense of forgiveness. So, in a sense, it sounds as if the people performing the mercy killing are forgiving the person who's dying. We are going to redeem you, be merciful to you by killing you. And so it's an interesting kind of connotation, not the intended one, but when you take into account the word mercy, yeah, you begin to wonder. And when we get further into it, in actual fact, that is one of the problems with what happens once you introduce legalisation of euthanasia. You actually create a sense of guilt. What happens? The people who are frail, people who are terminally ill, people who are chronically ill and heavily dependent upon medical care, the age, they can be made to feel a burden. That the right thing for them to do would be to relieve the society of this burden by accepting euthanasia. And so there is this connotation of that guilt for being a burden. The other big thing regarding euthanasia is the extent of fear, the role that fear plays in the request for euthanasia. And how does one respond mercifully to fear? Do you affirm the fear and kill the person in fear? Or do you try and relieve the fear? Euthanasia says, oh yeah, I agree with your fear and I'll put you out of your fear by killing you. It doesn't actually remove the fear. And so we've got things like the fear of pain, which is actually in fact a relatively small factor in euthanasia, but it is one. You've got the fear of prolonged dying, which is quite significant and it is played upon often by the pro-euthanasia crowd by the way they portray dying, which shouldn't necessarily be the way that they portray it and wouldn't be if we properly funded palliative care. And then you have that fear of being a burden, which is certainly raised by once you introduced euthanasia, the idea that, you know, we shouldn't be a burden on society and we should relieve society of this burden. So surely the question becomes, how do we mercifully respond to fears like that? And it seems to me euthanasia seems to be an imposed mercy. Some people quip, they say, are you really relieving the suffering person of their suffering, or are you relieving yourself of the suffering by killing the suffering patient? In other words, relieving yourself of the burden. So the true response in mercy, it seems to me, is that of, once again, we come back to mercy as compassion. And probably nowhere do we find this more poignantly than in the case of those who are terminally ill. Because, as you know, the literal meaning of compassion is to suffer with. And there's no suffering with quite like suffering with and being powerless. To be suffering with the person who's suffering and dying and be powerless. That might be part of what stands behind the drive for some people to euthanasia, because they want to take power rather than sit and suffer with in their powerlessness. And know that very powerlessness in being with the person becomes an act of solidarity, becomes an act of being with, of strengthening them, becomes a strengthening of a relationship with them, becomes really consolation as well as compassion. Now I could go on to talk about all the things we should be doing in care of the dying, but that would be for a talk on euthanasia proper. But just the expression that we often use in the context of palliative care, always care, never kill. We should be caring about people right up until the end, and be able to accompany people along the path of living up until their natural death. And so just to finish off, we hear much talk about the works of mercy, and we'll probably hear more about it during the Year of Mercy, but I think the whole of the works of mercy, to some extent, could be summed up by, once again, John Paul II, when he said, "It is a service of love which we are all committed to ensure to our neighbour that his or her life may be always defended and promoted, especially when it is weak or threatened." And once again, what lies behind what I think is an attitude of all mercy towards human life is that we need to rediscover with deep religious awe that ability to revere and honour every person. If we do that, then I think people will experience the merciful justice of God. And I'll leave it there and take questions. Thank you very much.